Hi everyone. Welcome to our February Bullitt History of Medicine Club talk. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Emily Long, a medical student co-leader of the club, along with Joshua DeJoya. We're excited to have Dr. Brett Whalen with us today to discuss a particularly pertinent topic, the doctors and the Black Death, reconsidering expertise in an age of pandemic. We're grateful to Dr. Whalen for joining us and to our partners at Wilson Library, our faculty advisor, Dr. Raul Necochea, and the UNC School of Medicine Infectious Disease Interest Group, who co-sponsored today's talk. A Q&A box will be available to you throughout Dr. Whalen's talk. As you think of questions for him, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll address them at the end. This lecture will be recorded and available later this week on the Bullitt Club website. I won't cut into his time because I'm looking forward to hearing what he has for us, but I do want to let you know a bit about our speaker. Dr. Whalen received his PhD from Stanford University in 2005. He currently teaches religious, intellectual, and cultural history in the Department of History at UNC. His research focuses on Christian intellectual and cultural history during the European Middle Ages. We're particularly excited about Dr. Whalen's latest book, Remembering the Black Death, Lessons from the Medieval Plague for the Modern Pandemic, which was published in September 2020 and forms the basis for today's talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brett Whalen.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Emily. Thank you also to Nadia Clifton from the Wilson Library for helping to organize the talk today. I'm very excited. I put on a tie for like the first time in a year, so I'm delighted to be here. And particularly on such a beautiful spring day, I'm thrilled that so many people are willing to be on Zoom for a lecture like this. So thank you. So like a lot of you, I imagine last March, I greeted the beginnings of the COVID-19 outbreak with a mixture of shock and disbelief and at points existential anxiety. Like a lot of other people in higher education, I also scrambled to readjust my teaching plans for what remained of the spring semester. I was teaching my large introductory class to medieval European history at the time. And when we returned after the spring break, the subject on my syllabus happened to be, by coincidence, you guessed it, the Black Death, the 14th century plague. And I remember sitting in my backyard, it was a beautiful spring day, and I was getting ready for class and was reading some of the material that I had assigned, rereading it, and was reading Boccaccio's Decameron, and some of you might be familiar with Boccaccio, 14th century Italian author. And in the opening to his masterpiece, he describes the impact of the Black Death in his native Florence. And I was reading about all the different kinds of reaction to the Black Death that he described. Some people choosing extreme isolation, others continuing to revel in the streets, treating the outbreak like an enormous joke, as he describes it. He talks about the loneliness, the sense of isolation. He talks about the disruption of daily habits and family bonds. There's a particularly poignant description of the disruptions caused to funerals by the plague. And as I was reading, somewhat incongruously on this nice spring day, I really felt like I was reading the headlines. As an historian, I always hope that my historical sources speak to me, but this was unusual. This was an unusual experience, this sense of immediacy as I read Boccaccio's description of the plague. And around that time, I felt an urgent need to write a short book on the Black Death, drawing comparisons between the medieval plague and the coronavirus pandemic. And when I say urgent, I meant it. It was kind of obsessive, and I dropped everything and worked on this short book that Emily mentioned, which I self-published on Amazon not too long ago. And as you can read about in that book, generally, living through COVID has transformed my understanding of the Black Death in a number of ways. For the Bullitt lecture, I thought it would make sense to focus on one particular element of this experience, which is namely some of the ways that I started to rethink expertise during the pandemic, specifically how physicians and public health experts try to deal with a given pandemic, to identify its origins, to account for its transmission, to formulate plans for avoiding the disease, preventing it, or minimizing its impact. And on the one hand, through my recent studies of the Black Death, I gained a newfound historical appreciation for the efforts of medieval experts to make sense of the 14th century plague, despite their lack of modern epidemiological knowledge and technologies, pardon me. On the other hand, in the present, I think we've all seen the crucial nature of expertise during a pandemic, along with some of the dangers that can result when experts are undermined or openly attacked for largely political purposes. And accordingly, I want to make two overall points today. First, we need to rethink the nature of expertise in the era of the Black Death. There's a common stereotype about the plague that contemporaries were utterly unprepared, utterly lacking any kind of proper knowledge or ability to deal with the pandemic that they were confronting. And as Philip Ziegler asserts in his popular book, The Black Death, quoting Ziegler here, medieval man was equipped with no form of defense, social, medical, or psychological, against a violent epidemic of this magnitude. So those experiencing the plague, Ziegler drives home, felt a baffled and terrified helplessness in the face of the disaster. Now, his book was published originally in 1969, I should point out, but it continues to be republished until quite recently. And so it's not atypical opinion about the medieval reactions to the Black Death. Medieval doctors in particular have been criticized for their slavish devotion to classical medical authorities like the Roman physician Galen, and their supposed refusal to make any medical recommendations based on their own empirical evidence. You know, they would basically take their faces out of the books and see the world around them. I hope to show today this is a gross oversimplification. It does no justice to the immense creativity of medieval physicians as they dealt with the undeniably devastating pandemic that struck their society. Second, I want to remind us, if we need reminding, that reason, science, and expertise are not guaranteed qualities of the way that modern man, so to speak, deals with a pandemic. As we've been seeing, the outbreak of the coronavirus contributed to a rash of rumors about the virus's origins, conspiracy theories about its transmission, and recommended quack cures for the illness. You know, if medieval people didn't always get it wrong, modern people don't always get it right, at least not at first. And this has certainly been the case, by the way, with the study of the Black Death. After a century of investigation by historians, archaeologists, and epidemiologists, experts still debate the origins, the causes, the transmission, and the consequences of the 14th century plague. When I started my research into the Black Death, not as you heard Emily's introduction, I'd worked mostly on intellectual cultural history, not an expert on the subject of medieval medicine or the plague. When I started this new round of research in the early days of COVID, I was struck very much by just how contested the history of the medieval plague has been and remains. And I think I was particularly sensitive to this state of uncertainty about the Black Death as I watched the constant struggles of public health officials, doctors, epidemiologists, and others to explain the nature of COVID-19 to a wider public in the present. Now, before going any further, I'm going to screen share here. I want to review the basics on the Black Death. So I'm assuming that's coming through okay. Maximize this, right. So the 14th century plague, known as the Black Death, is generally considered to be the second of three pandemics, pardon me, the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, the Black Death, and the so-called third pandemic, which began in the late 19th century. Three pandemics of bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis. The bacteria is named after Alexander Yersin, who's first correctly identified the bacillus in the late 19th century. It's considered an enzootic disease, which is to say that it is naturally existing among rodent populations. These are sometimes called plague reservoirs, and it seems that the plague reservoir for the Black Death was in Central Asia amongst gerbils, marmots, and others rodents. And when introduced to a new rodent population previously unexposed, the disease can become panzootic. It's basically a pandemic for animals. The plague spreads, and there's an illustration over here showing illustrating this diagram, some of what I'm talking about right now. The plague can leap to humans through flea bites. And what happens is that the flea's digestive system, as you're seeing in this somewhat difficult to look at picture of this flea, the flea's digestive system can become blocked. And so the flea winds up unable to eat and regurgitating the blood back into its host and transmits the bacteria into the host. Now, a single flea bite won't do this, but multiple flea bites can. And when you reach a sufficient bacterial load, it can transmit the plague. Now, the resulting illness comes in 3 different forms. The first is called the bubonic plague. You're seeing here 20th century illustration of one of the buboes, or the lumps that develop as the lymph nodes swell up from the bacilli. And this is usually in the groin, in the neck, or in the armpits, or in the groin. As the plague overwhelms the lymphatic system, the victim will run a high fever, vomit, become delirious. It's deadly. As many as 40% of the people infected with the bubonic plague can survive, but it still has a very high mortality rate. Under certain circumstances, the bubonic plague can turn into what's called the pneumonic form of the plague. And this is when it gets into the respiratory system and can then be transmitted through person to person through infected droplets, coughed into the air. And this has a much higher, like 80–90% mortality rate. And you can die within a day or two. Whereas with the bubonic plague, it can take days, if not longer, to pass away. And there's a third form of plague called septicemic plague, when the bacilli either overwhelms quickly the lymph node system, or can be directly introduced into the bloodstream by like an animal bite or an instrument. And that is especially deadly. It basically doesn't leave any survivors when you have the septicemic form of the plague. I still get confused about the septicemic form of the plague. Maybe there's a medical expert on this talk that we could get into this during the Q&A. Now, it's traditionally understood the Black Death, the disease we call the Black Death, began somewhere in Central Asia around the 1330s, and spread via the Silk Roads. You're seeing on this map, this network of caravan trails and roads and different routes that tied together Eastern Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and onto the edges of Europe and Africa. So there's this network tying together Eurasia and Africa. And the idea is the plague would have traveled along these routes. I mean, we can probably all understand this nowadays, right? Thinking about plane travel and how global networks of commerce and transportation can spread pandemics. This was the 14th century equivalent of the global village. And the plague apparently reached China in the 1330s, although there's some debate about this, actually. By 1337, it's evident that the plague had reached the area of the Black Sea on the edges of Europe. And the primary vector for the spread here, it's believed, was Xenosiliciopus, which is the fur flea. That the fleas would have been on rodents being transported in these caravans, or maybe even existing themselves in, say, grain shipments or furs. And apparently a flea can live for up to 6 weeks without a host. So the fleas might have been in the grain being transported around. Now, what we do know is that the plague had broken out in 1346 in the area of the Black Sea, and was brought back from that region by Italian merchants and ships from the Black Sea back to Sicily and Italy. And there's a particular story here related to the city here with the red arrow of Caffa, which was a Genoese port city that was actually besieged by a Mongol army at this point. And according to Gabriele de Musès, who is a contemporary living in Italy, he reports that the sickness broke out in the Mongol army, and they began catapulting dead bodies, corpses, into the city. And this was part of what spread the infection. And this is sometimes referred to as the first known act of biological warfare. And from there, as you can see on this map, over the following months and years, the Black Death reached into really every corner of Europe, also into the Middle East and into North Africa. The primary vector for the spread now, it is believed generally, was the black rat, Rattus. And fleas on the black rat would have, particularly in port cities, there's evidence that cities acted as hotspots for the spread. And the plague unevenly wound up over the course of several years, reaching, as I said, into virtually every corner of Europe and other parts of the Mediterranean. It's estimated that it might have killed as much as 2/3 of the population over this period, maybe as many as 50 million people, depending on how you cook your numbers for the population of Europe at the time. After the pandemic subsided, starting around 1350, 1351, plague did become endemic in Europe. It didn't go away. There would be outbreaks every several decades for the next 200 plus years. So it never causing the same drastic level of mortality, but really becoming a regular part of life. So needless to say, medieval doctors didn't understand the plague in these sorts of epidemiological or historical terms, right? How could they? I mean, they didn't even know what bacteria was, right? Nevertheless, there were 14th century university-trained physicians in Europe that represented the highest levels of expertise available during the Black Death, such as the university faculty, the medical faculty at the University of Paris, which issued a compendium on the causes of the plague, or the pestilence as they called it, in October 1348. There were other celebrity doctors. I sometimes think of them as like the Anthony Faucis of the 14th century. Gentile de Foligno, who was at the University of Perugia, Jacques d'Agremont at the University of Lerida, Alfonso de Cordoba, who was active at the University of Montpellier, and last but not least, Guy de Chauliac, who served at the Papal Court in Avignon. And all of these physicians and more wrote plague tracts. They're sometimes called concilia, during or not long after the Black Death hit Europe. I should point out much of their knowledge drew upon or depended upon even broader networks of international learning, drawing upon Latin translation of Arabic medical tracts that were often translated from Greek. And so there's this whole other world of Islamic medicine and Islamic reaction to the plagues that could really be a talk unto itself. Now, these physicians viewed the Black Death, its causes, its transmission, its treatment, within the matrix of what's sometimes called humoral theory. And many of you on this call might be familiar with this basic premise that the health was maintained by the proper balance of the bodily humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. And each humor, in turn, governed aspects of bodily health. And imbalance in the humors could cause physical or mental sickness. And you're seeing a late medieval 15th century illustration here of the four humors and in the different parts of and how the humors influence different parts of the body. Pestilence or plague was caused by, or in some ways actually was, miasma, a corrupted or bad air. When breathed into the body, that miasma could disrupt the balance of its humors, overheat the heart and lungs, and rot the surrounding tissue. And it thereby putrefied the flesh, and it destroyed the life force, as the Paris physicians put it. Classical medical texts, as you're seeing here, also identified an additional 6 external factors that impacted health, sometimes called non-naturals. And these included the quality of the air, food and drink, rest and forms of exercise, sleep and wakefulness, secretion and excretion, and mental cares or emotions, or as they are sometimes rather poetically called, the afflictions of the soul. And all of these factors, these environmental factors, could make the body more or less susceptible to the miasma and the resulting sickness. Now, what caused the miasma, though? You might be wondering, right? If you ask the Paris medical faculty or any other physician, they would say God. They would say God was the ultimate cause of the plague, which was intended as a punishment for human sins. And this could be a whole nother talk about these sorts of devotional responses and religious responses to the Black Death. Within 14th century theology, though, natural science and medicine, heavily influenced by Aristotle, any doctor worth his salt would also understand that the natural world followed certain mechanistic laws. It obeyed certain kinds of order. which could be investigated and understood through the application of reason. And I think this is important because there is a stereotype here, right? I think in the Middle Ages, people thought God caused the plague. Everyone started sort of flagellating themselves as an act of penance. And that's like the end of the story. And that's just not the case. And I think it's worth noting here as well that belief in the plague as a divine punishment didn't preclude a search for its natural causes. I mean, people in the 14th century were able to figure out that medicine and faith were complementary and not necessarily at odds. Now, the causes of the miasma came in two forms. They were remote and local. And the remote causes in this case denoted the motions of heavenly bodies, which impacted the earthly environment, the balance of the humors, and the body's health. And you're seeing here a very early print representation of the medieval cosmos, and remind you that the Earth is at the center of these series of spheres with the moon, Mercury, the sun, Mars, etc. And you're seeing over on this medieval medical illustration here, again, the idea about Saturn, Jupiter, and the moon down here, these different bodies have an influence over different aspects of the humors and bodily health. And I should note, when you read, say, the Paris Consultation, along with a number of other texts from this period, they're very clear that different planets possessed different qualities that governed how they impacted the elements on Earth and also human health and human activities. As the Paris Masters observed, Mars was a hot and malevolent planet that bred anger and wars. Saturn was a cold and antagonistic planet that could bring bitter humors and thick clouds. Now, depending on what constellation that a conjunction occurred in, the alignment of planets in different combinations could create varying effects. And in their consultation, the faculty of Paris specifically identified a conjunction of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter in the constellation of Aquarius in March 1345 as the first cause of the pestilence. And really, this is like a perfect storm. It's a perfect astrological storm for causing a plague. Local causes, on the other hand, occurred in the sublunar region, as it was described, below the heavenly spheres. This is a region of change and corruptibility. Physicians believe that miasma resulting from the conjunction of the planets must have been compounded by earthquakes that release noxious vapors into the atmosphere. Earthquakes could also kill and scatter immense amounts of fish and animals and other kinds of carcasses, which would leave their decomposing bodies scattered around that might add to the putrefaction. Harmful vapors, by the way, could also come from swamps, from lakes, from chasms, and also from unburied or unburnt corpses. And so there was a sense about plague war could make plague worse by resulting in all these corpses. Climate also played a role, as unseasonably hot and humid weather allowed for the quick spread of the corrupt air. The Paris faculty observed that there had been this kind of hot and humid weather for several seasons preceding the arrival of the pestilence, as they called it. Corrupted by the conjunction, the vapors drawn from the earth and from the sea, quote, were spread and multiplied by frequent gusts of thick, wild, and southerly winds, which, on account of the foreign vapors, they have brought and are still bringing with them. And these have corrupted the air in its substance. Now, much like their modern counterparts, medieval experts didn't 100% agree on the causes of the Black Death or how it spread. Some floated alternative theories. Alfonso de Cordoba, for example, suggested a more nefarious origin for the plague, which was poison. And he went on about how one might strategically place and smash poison-filled jars, amphores, upwind from cities and towns to spread the illness. And Alfonso didn't name any culprits, but others blamed Jewish communities in their midst for causing the plague in this manner through poison, or particularly through the poisoning of water sources. And this, again, is the question of scapegoating is yet a whole nother topic we could get into in terms of pandemics. There was another anonymous doctor from Montpellier who pushed his favorite theory that the disease could be transmitted by sight. And this worked much like sunlight going through a concave glass that could start fires. It's kind of like a laser, basically. And this means of transmission actually made sense from the perspective of medieval optics, which maintained that sight happened when rays actually shot out from the eye, literally touching the visible object and bouncing back to the eye. So what you're dealing with really through sight is the possibility of a form of contagion. In addition to sight, I should point out medieval doctors generally recognized that sickness could be transmitted by person-to-person contact. Pestilent breath, as they described it. Again, it's its own form of what we would call contagion. Now, I get it. You might be thinking, these explanations were wrong, right? The Black Death was not caused by a conjunction of planets. It wasn't caused by earthquakes or miasma. But I would submit that these explanations had their own kind of intellectually impressive coherency. They had their own internal logic. The doctor's analysis of the pestilence was deliberately intended for what they called the benefit of the public or the common good. And this is an expression that appears, by the way, in many of the plague tracts. These weren't ivory tower musings for their own sake. As John Arrizabalaga reminds us, 14th century doctors viewed the Black Death as a social disaster more than anything else. And they communicated their findings to royal authorities. It was actually King Philip VI that asked the Paris faculty to produce their compendium. They communicated their findings to town officials, to civic councils and town officials. And in some cases, they really did act as what we would now call public health advisors. And by the way, some of them wrote their tracts in vernacular, not in Latin, for precisely this reason, to communicate to a wider audience of lay people. So framed in this way, understood in this way, much of the ensuing medical advice they gave to avoid or to prevent contracting the plague actually makes a great deal of sense, even if sometimes unintentionally. First and foremost, physicians advised flight to escape the miasma, encouraging residents to leave places that might be more susceptible to the corrupt air, hot, marshy coastal regions in favor of cooler or more elevated destinations. Doctors knew that proximity to infected people was dangerous, and they instructed the readers to avoid the breath or even the gaze of infected individuals. That's dangerous. And they instructed the readers to avoid them, particularly when they were in the throes of their illness. If a person was unable to flee, the next step was to combat putrefaction of the air by burning fires in the home, including fragrant plants such as rosemary, cypress, or myrtle. Others suggested carrying fragrant poultices under their nose, something like the masks of the day, right? And Boccaccio describes these at great detail. Others suggested anointing your body with oils to counteract the miasma. And I have, again, I'll be curious to hear some reactions to this. I've never read this anywhere, but I have a pet theory here that burned or applied as an oil, sage, mint, other aromatics are still suggested today as natural repellent against fleas and other insects. So given the role of fleas in transmitting the bubonic plague, I actually wondered if these fumigants or these ointments might have unintentionally offered some protection from contracting the plague. Beyond the individual, I will add that following the advice of such medical experts about the ways of limiting miasma and contagion, communities like Pistoia in Italy passed ordinances to regulate the flow of persons and goods in and out of the city. They mandated precise burial instructions for the plague victims, including the depth of the grave. They limited public gatherings at funerals. They issued strict rules and regulations for the slaughtering of animals and the tanning of animal hides within the city to minimize the possibility of corrupt air. And I have been fascinated about outbreaks of COVID at meat processing factories, by the way, and thinking about this regulation of meat and how it fits in pandemics. Doctors like Gentile, de Foligno, Jacques d'Agremont generally agreed on the need to moderate the consumption of food and drink to help maintain the balance of bodily humors, to make one's body less susceptible to corruptive forces in the miasma. Jacques in particular mentioned the need to moderate one's consumption of alcohol, which I don't know about the rest of you, but that's good advice during a pandemic. Physicians equally advised the consumption of theriacs as a prophylactic measure or treatment for the plague. These were mixtures of various compounds such as cinnamon, camphor, aloe, and snakeskin. I will add that the medicinal value of these theriacs might seem to be dubious at first glance, but I just read this fascinating article not too long ago by Christian Nockels-Fabry on medieval theriac. And this article points out that a major compound in most theriacs was opium. And you can take a look at this table I'm showing you here. And the idea is that opium may very well have offered effective pain relief if someone had the plague. It might have helped with vomiting. It might have helped with diarrhea. I mean, it certainly seems preferable to imbibing or injecting bleach to prevent the coronavirus, for example. And you can see on this table a number of different medieval remedies that seem to have had the possibility of some therapeutic value. I should mention, Gentile notes that only those who could afford them should be drinking these theriacs, and he advised people of limited means to drink mixtures of holy water and scallions or consume garlic. So you can kind of see like a two-tiered healthcare at work here. Last but not least, 14th century physicians recognized that health during a pandemic didn't just mean caring for the body, but also for the mind. And I think I found this most surprising and interesting. Jacques d'Agremont, for example, took into account the powerful effects of fear and imagination in the case of bodily sickness. From the imagination alone, he says, can come any malady. And he actually talks about this idea. Imagine if you're asked to walk over a narrow plank on the ground. It's easy enough to do. If you put the plank up on a high place, fear sets in and it makes the task all the more difficult. The difference is in the imagination. Jacques may advise his readers to generally try to think cheerful thoughts, particularly to avoid chiming bells, church bells for the dead, which reminded the living about the deceased and thereby caused evil imaginings. And I'll note that in Pistoia and other cities limited the ringing of church bells during funerals during the pandemic, I think precisely for this reason. So, the advice here of Jacques is really to try to stay positive and avoid dwelling on negative thoughts and things out of one's control, which is, I think, something we can probably all relate to during COVID. I'm going to end my screen share here. So hopefully I've with this quick tour of 14th century reactions to the Black Death, I've convinced you that medieval experts might have done a far more capable job of wrestling with the medieval plague than we might give them credit for, even if they couldn't prevent the massive mortality that was caused by the disease. And I should note, until the 20th century, in the invention of antibiotics, which can arrest the disease caused by Yersinia pestis, no one really had an effective treatment for the bubonic plague, not just medieval citizens. So for the remainder of my talk, I want to shift gears slightly, and I want to suggest some of the ways that studying the Black Death in the era of COVID-19, in addition to changing my understanding of medieval expertise, has refined my expertise of my understanding, of modern expertise as it relates to pandemics. By their nature, pandemics generate confusion and defy easy explanations. Now, this might not seem like a particularly earth-shattering realization, but I think I've sincerely internalized it in over the last 11 months in ways that I wouldn't have if I hadn't been living through COVID. And so give you an example of this confusion and how pandemics defy easy explanations. Consider the history of the Black Death. Consider the history of the 14th century pandemic. After a century of painstaking investigations, historians, scientists continue to debate over the origins and transmission of the medieval plague. Until recently, there were scientists, scholars, who insisted that the 14th century pestilence was not the bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, based on what they saw as inconsistent descriptions of the disease's symptoms and surviving sources and the mortality rates. Historians, in particular like Samuel Cone Jr., argued that the disease was some other bacteria or virus, maybe a form of hemorrhagic fever or anthrax. And it's been over just the last 12 years or so that this whole debate has been effectively settled by scientific advancements in the study of ancient microbial DNA, aDNA. The genome of Yersinia pestis was sequenced by a group of English scientists in 2001. And around that time, taking samples from teeth pulp, which preserve traces of aDNA, scientists have taken traces of teeth pulp from medieval graves, to be clear, from graves from the Black Death. Scientists have been able to show that the outbreak in the 14th century was the bubonic plague. There's still an open question here, by the way, to account for some of the differences in the death rate, whether the whether the variant of Yersinia pestis that caused the plague was a different strain of Yersinia pestis. And so far, they haven't determined whether it was or wasn't. But I find this interesting, this question, given the different strains of COVID, new variants that are starting to surface. Now, even if this debate's been resolved, okay, it was Yersinia pestis, all sorts of questions remain about the Black Death. Ole Benedictau, an historical expert on the subject, argues that the plague couldn't have spread along the Silk Roads the way scholars assume. He thinks the distances were too great. The average movement of a camel-drawn caravan at 25 kilometers a day is too slow. He thinks that the arid and cold conditions in Central Asia would make it really unlikely for the fleas to survive. And he actually posits a slow natural transfer taking like decades between rodent populations. Maybe this when the rodents were disrupted through climate change, and this eventually led to the plague being in the region of the Black Sea. And so the outbreak actually started in the Black Sea. Person-to-person form is difficult. In the pneumonic form, it basically kills you too quickly. You can't really have a pandemic that way because you wouldn't survive long enough to move around and spread the plague. So the pneumonic form might cause a localized outbreak, but would be difficult to cause a pandemic. Others have questioned whether the black rat is a sufficient explanation for the spread of the plague in Europe. They argue some that there wasn't enough rats in Europe and there's no evidence of them in the archaeological record to act as hosts for the fleas. Some have responded to this, arguing that maybe human fleas, Pulex irritans, might have spread the plague, or maybe even lice. On the other hand, my understanding is there's a debate about this, that these sorts of ectoparasitic vectors, as they're called, can't reach a sufficient bacterial load to transmit the disease. That their systems, their digestive systems don't back up the same way that the fur flea does. So maybe lice can't spread the plague or human fleas. I was just reading about this in a 2018 issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. As Monica Green puts it, she's another expert, a historian of the plague, there is still no plausible, comprehensive theory that explains the outbreak of the Black Death. Speaking of which, now's the point in the talk where I have to cast doubt on everyone's favorite story, including my own, of the medieval biological warfare at Kaffa. There's problems with that story. Dead bodies don't cause plague. Fleas do. Fleas leave a cooling corpse within minutes. So even if you shot a bunch of bodies with a catapult into the city of Kaffa, there wouldn't have presumably been a lot of fleas in their body. Even if there was a few fleas maybe in their clothes, it wouldn't have been enough fleas to create a sufficient bacterial load to spread the disease. And so this whole idea of it being biological warfare just doesn't really hold up in terms of its epidemiology. It's far more likely, historians are now arguing, that the plague just spread through the rat populations in the sewers and through cracks in the city walls. This is a much less exciting story, right? It's a much less sensationalist story, but it makes a lot more sense. The biological warfare claim, by the way, was repeated uncritically by Pat Lee Shipman in his article, The Bright Side of the Black Death. This was in the American Scientist, 2014. And just recently in, quote, A History of the Plague, an Ancient Pandemic for the Age of COVID-19. This was just published in the Journal of Medicine in 2020. So it's hard to put a stake in the heart of that particular story about the catapulted corpse. I've told that in lecture for years, and now I'm going to have to be a lot more careful. Now, to be clear, to start to conclude my remarks here, I want to be clear that the point of my observations about the limits of modern expertise is not to attack or discount the value of experts. Quite the opposite. We need to value modern expertise and not take it for granted. I'll add at the same time that I don't think we should necessarily place blind trust in experts of any kind. I think we need to maintain a healthy skepticism, above all, of the institutions that sometimes house experts and promote expertise, particularly when politics are involved. But we do need to remember that expertise evolves over time as we obtain, digest, and draw conclusions from the facts, from the data, from the evidence. My recent studies of the Black Death have reminded me, yet again, that facts matter. And it may be sad that I have to say this, but here we are. I probably don't need to explain to you, there have been widely divergent attitudes about the severity of COVID-19, based in large part on where people get their information and what sort of facts they choose to believe. Not too long ago, when interviewed on CNN on January 22nd, when asked whether a lack of candor or facts contributed to some of the deaths caused by COVID, Anthony Fauci replied, you know, it very likely did. And so the commitment to facts, this is not just an academic dilemma. This is a matter of life and death. Thinking long term, beyond the immediate crisis that we find ourselves in, what we do with the facts about the coronavirus as we understand them remains to be seen. Armed with the evidence, historians still debate the long-term consequences of the Black Death. Beyond the body count, beyond the initial disaster, how the plague might or might not have reshaped European society, and even the possibility that the plague, after its initial horrors, contributed to some positive developments for medieval Europeans. As for the historical consequences of the coronavirus pandemic, we don't know what they'll be. This history is still unwritten. Now, whether future historians will look back and see COVID as a turning point in history, for example, when we realized the need for universal health care, or the need for living wages and workplace protections, the need to respect and not dismiss scientific expertise, to recognize and tackle the threats posed by climate change, which could make COVID, frankly, look like a walk in the park. That is up to us. So thank you for your attention. And I would love to field some questions from the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Whalen. That was great. We'll give people just a few minutes to start typing their questions into the chat, and I'll read them aloud, and then you can answer them however you see fit.
Sure.
We had one come in while you were talking, and I think it wants a little bit more clarification maybe on your closing remarks. Yeah. It says, looking ahead to the post-COVID world, what can the 14th century teach us about the most likely long-term consequences?
Well, that's a great question, and I see some others in the chat. This is great. One of the points I try to make at the end of the book is the dangers of forgetting, and this was a complaint by some of the observers of the Black Death. Now, for them, it was very much couched in a kind of Christian moralistic framework that, if God had punished people for their sins, people hadn't learned their lesson. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that that's the takeaway lesson, but there is an idea that a lot of whatever consequences the Black Death had for medieval Europe and other parts of the world, it seems to have happened not just through the initial plague, but through the fact that there was these repeated pandemics over and over every 20, 30 years. And they had a cumulative effect that was quite significant. I think one of the things I've learned thinking about the Black Death is the need not to forget and to think that things, will just, when they go back to normal, you don't have to worry about it. We need to plan for the next pandemic now. If COVID, much like the Black Death, if the outbreak of COVID we're living through is just the first in a sequence or series of pandemics, I think that could have drastic and dramatic impacts on our society in ways that, for all the challenges and the horrific over 500,000 deaths COVID has caused, we could be staring at something much worse. So one of my takeaways from the Black Death is a need to not forget and to actually plan for the next pandemic now.
Thank you. So we also have, how did 14th century medical people disseminate health advice? Did political authorities try to enforce any of the advice, like our mask mandates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I mentioned briefly in the talk, I've been observing that. So if you're on the university faculty at Paris, if you're educated as a doctor, this means that you're a member of the church clergy. You'd have some sort of rank in the clergy to be a member of these experts I'm discussing, right? And you would know Latin. And so, Latin in the Middle Ages, including the 14th century, was the language of learning and higher education. However, by the 14th century, in many different areas of life, you're seeing an increased use of the vernacular, Old French, Middle English, Catalan, etc. Boccaccio writes the Decameron in Italian, a dialect of Italian. And so I think it's interesting that several of these plague tracts were written in the vernacular. In the doctors, like Guy de Chilliac, he says straight up, I'm writing this so lay people, people who are not members of the church, could understand the advice he was getting. And again, I'm drawing on John Arrizabalaga's article here, but he talks about how there's evidence that these doctors were actually consulting with civic officials and giving them advice about how to do these sort of regulations of traffic in and out of the city and the meat markets, et cetera. So there's clearly a dialogue going on. Now, I don't know how much this ever made it down to the level of an agricultural worker or a peasant farmer who presumably had folk medicine that we don't know about. I think there's probably a whole world of medieval medical knowledge that's very difficult to access because we don't have the written accounts for it. Very, very quickly, I did wonder, like, was there any sort of like open Pistoia now protests in 1348? And I haven't found any evidence of that, that there was a deliberate rejection. I have noticed, just leave you with this point, that there's an initial version of the ordinances from Pistoia, and there's a revised version that came out several months later, and several of the provisions are dropped, including the idea of letting in people from the neighboring towns. And I sometimes wonder if there was such pushback against those, or if people just disregarded them, frankly, that the city decided it wasn't worth trying to enforce those parts of the ordinance. So my suspicion is that there was some pushback, although I haven't found direct evidence.
And this question, I think, sort of piggybacks off of the last one. Can you speak to the present day difficulties of imposing the centuries-old but highly effective practice of quarantine in stemming the tide of pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point that quarantine, the idea of quarantine does not emerge during the Black Death itself. Neither do those plague doctor masks, by the way. This is something I've started to become a little grouchy about, is people showing pictures of these plague masks with the kind of beak that you could put the aromatics in. That started to come out later in the 14th century, but people use that as an image for the Black Death. It's not exactly accurate. Quarantine seems to develop later in the 1300s or early 1400s in Italy. I think it's not a coincidence. I've been very much struck living through COVID on the difference between the experience of the pandemic as an urban phenomenon and a rural phenomenon, and the different ways that has impacted people's experience, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the measures we still think of as kind of ground floor for dealing with a pandemic, like quarantine, evolved in very late medieval or early modern urban areas. I mean, it still is one of the most effective ways of dealing with quarantine. This is getting beyond my area. I mean, in some ways, none of this is in my area of previous expertise, but I'm assuming the wearing of masks, for example, really started to become an issue after people had identified like bacteria and viruses, and truly, and if somebody wants to chime in who works on this from the medical school, I'm assuming that's kind of like a late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon.
We also have, with respect to those who, during the time of the Black Death, were cavalier, was there any indication of community sanction or mass shaming by others around them via existing networks like church, trade, or markets?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I got distracted. I had my chat open. That was horrible of me.
Sure. So with respect to those who, during the time of the Black Death, were cavalier, was there any indication of community sanction or mask shaming by others around them by existing networks such as church, trade, and markets?
That's a great question, and I don't know of any formal sanctions. I will say that Boccaccio was underwhelmed by them. Now, again, he's a single author, writing the Decameron. But one of the points, and people have suggested that Boccaccio might have even exaggerated the extent of the chaos in Florence to illustrate the disruptions caused by the plague and set the stage for his book. He seemed profoundly disgruntled or upset by the fact that people were abandoning their relatives, servants were no longer caring for the sick, that there was this kind of breakdown of the social order, that people were treating the plague as a joke. So, I don't know of official sanctions, but I do know that clearly in the case of Boccaccio, I think there was a disdain or a disapproval of people that were abandoning their sense of social obligation, I guess you could say. It's interesting. One of the things that church authorities did do is call for sermons as penitential gatherings to bring people together, to pray collectively to avert the plague. And in terms of modern disease spread, you realize getting all these people together at these gatherings might have been incredibly dangerous or fostered the spread of the disease. Of course, I've noticed during COVID that attending church has emerged as a real fault line in some of the culture wars over COVID. I mean, people choose to congregate sometimes even when they know the potentially disastrous consequences, right? I mean, we've seen this with COVID. So my assumption is that people reacted to this the Black Death in similar ways, and internalized it in different manners. Certainly, as I said, Boccaccio was not thrilled. I want to jump in quickly, and I saw from Margaret that Monica Green has an important article on the plague in the most recent edition of the American Historical Review. Thank you. I have not. I think it's getting delivered to my office, not to my home. Monica Green, if you're interested in the subject, she's been working on the Black Death for some time, and I'm gonna read that as soon as possible. Yeah.
We also have, how likely do you think it is that the story of the corpses catapulted into the besieged city was a result of widespread Islamophobia in medieval and early modern Europe?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I really, the whole catapulting thing has become this kind of red thread for me in this, because I think first of all, we've all seen with COVID that the appeal of these sensational stories for the spread of a pandemic. COVID, being linked to the creation of 5G telecommunications networks, or being developed in a bioweapons lab in the United States and then shipped to China, or there's all these different explanations for the spread of the disease. I have a distant family member in-law who apparently thinks that the government is giving people COVID when they do the swab tests for the disease. So, the idea of sensational stories and their appeal, I think, has been really evident to me during COVID. And the catapulting bodies really, it's a great story. And I do think Benedictile Oleg suggests that maybe the Mongols thought they were practicing miasmatic warfare, that not biological warfare, because they didn't know what bacteria was, but if you catapulted the dead bodies, it might have created miasma in the city. So maybe they thought they were doing that. Not to mention it would demoralize people inside the city to have corpses being catapulted in. To your question, there's a book, it's Captivating Histories. And there's the Captivating History of the Black Death available on Amazon. I would not recommend buying this book. I think it is incredibly subpar and repeats many of the stereotypes about the plague that I've related to you today. Interestingly, to your point, when you read the section about the catapulting of the bodies, they seem to be suggesting that these outside infidels were attacking Europe through biological warfare. And so I think it's interesting you asked this question. I felt like there was a hint of perhaps Islamophobia, or at least a kind of xenophobic element to the way this particular book repeated the story of the catapults. So.
And we have two more questions, and I think that will about wrap us up. What training did 14th century physicians receive before being recognized as physicians?
That's a great question. I'm going to sort of defer in this. As I mentioned, they'd be part of the clergy. There was a medical university at Salerno going back to the 11th century. You would need, I think the key here, I don't know a lot about the precise training. I saw someone ask, like, I do read Latin, this is my main research language. And you would have Latin text, as I mentioned, many of them translated from Arabic, that would immerse a doctor first and foremost in the world of classical learning. Galen, for example, who's an ancient Roman historian, his texts were seen as being authoritative. And through this talk, I don't want to give you the impression that medieval doctors were not first and fundamentally trained through reading texts, because they were. That was it wasn't just medieval doctors. I mean, medieval theologians, really any kind of natural philosophy was grounded in the idea of authority and received wisdom, whether it was the Bible or church fathers like Augustine of Hippo, or classical authorities like Galen. But you can read there's an account of the Black Death in Avignon where it mentions that the Pope ordered some of the doctors to perform autopsies to figure out what was going on with the plague. And sometimes there's a stereotype, like people in the Middle Ages wouldn't do autopsies, and that's just not true. So you can also imagine a medieval doctor performing an autopsy and seeing what the human body looked like, probably comparing it to what Galen described and trying to figure out how the two fit together. So it's a great question.
Yeah, and we just have one more.
Please.
Did any of the military orders play a role in relief of plague sufferers? Specifically, an example is Knights of St. John of Jerusalem.
Yeah. And my answer to that is I have no idea. Now, the Templars, the Templar military order, as some of the listeners might know, had been kind of ruthlessly disbanded by Philip IV in the early 1300s. So the Templars were in no position to help anyone at that point. The Hospitallers did originate as a order that cared for pilgrims and the sick. That's a great question. I don't know. That should, we should go on the International Medieval Bibliography and start searching around. Because I would be interested to know more about that. I will say, even if there's no evidence of the Hospitallers helping out during the actual Black Death, it would not surprise me at all thinking about them or the thinking about these military orders when the plague breaks out in, say, 15th or 16th or century Italy. I almost guarantee in some of these early modern outbreaks of the plague that the Hospitallers were involved. But that's just my hunch. So
That's interesting. Well, thank you, Dr. Whalen, for such a great talk, and also to all of you for joining us today and for asking such engaging questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed it, and I wish I could see some of you, but hopefully I'll meet some of you in person someday. That sounds great.
I hope everyone can also mark your calendars for our next event. We have lightning talks on research from UNC School of Medicine students on Tuesday, March 30th at noon. And today's lecture was recorded and it'll be available on our website later this week. If you're interested in delving deeper into this topic, I hope you'll order a copy of Dr. Whalen's book, Remembering the Black Death, available on Amazon. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks.